Tonight on History So It Doesn't Repeat, we feature a presentation by Tragedy and Hope researcher Darrell Becker, discovering how to formulate effective critical thinking and empathetic communication skills, and how by carefully selecting our words, we can all be the change we want to see in the world. Learning's the answer. What's the question? It's all coming up next on History So It Doesn't Repeat.
Welcome back to History So It Doesn't Repeat. I'm your host and navigator, Richard Grove, and tonight's episode is one which you'll want to watch and then revisit often, as it features a combined skill set that we can use every day of our lives and a habit which, if initiated in your own mind, will bring you a lot of satisfaction, serenity, and happiness consistently in your life. The topic is how to effectively communicate with empathy in a world where we're trained to use obligatory words and language instead of voluntary phrases. Some call it nonviolent communication, but tonight we'll see if we can work the words empathetic, compassionate, and conscious communication into our dictionary of cognitive liberty. Joining me via Skype is Darrell Becker in the sunny climes of Hawaii, and from Pennsylvania is executive producer Tony Myers. For tonight's discussion, I thought the first thing we should discuss would be the purpose and goal. Who would like to go first in discussing what they seek to get out of this conversation tonight and how we might get there?
That would be me. I'm Darrell Becker, and I would like to explain why it is that I saw value in putting these concepts together, the concept specifically of the Trivium Method of critical thinking and nonviolent communication tactics as they are generally taught, and also as these tactics have recently been hacked or innovated. I saw value in these applications, and what I basically was seeing was a great disconnect in many people trying to explain important ideas to each other as there were problems. I isolated some of these problems using these two techniques, which is what I plan to do a presentation with today and answer some of your pertinent questions, Rich.
All right, that's a great start. Tony, what do you have to say about this?
I'd first like to say that Cody Hall, a member of the Tragedy and Hope community, saw value in getting in touch with Darrell Becker, who has been studying concepts in nonviolent communication. And I myself, who had studied the Trivium in depth, along with Richard Grove and Lisa and other members and perpetuators of Tragedy and Hope, saw value in getting into a different side of applying the Trivium through a rhetorical model that could be useful and competent for other individuals.
I think it's because we all have a level of empathy for each other and compassion going through life's experiences, having a map that doesn't reflect the terrain. And now that we've found some tools of navigation, a compass, if you will, and the ability to not recreate the terrain, but create a map that reflects the terrain, that's one step. That's using the Trivium. Now that we have this useful map, how do we communicate with others? How do we bridge this disconnect? How do we cross that gap? And that's why Darrell is here tonight to talk about. Let's talk about first the origins of the word empathy. I understand it's only been around for about a century. Darrell, what have you learned about this word?
Well, in my very small investigation on etymology of empathy, I basically found that it was very, very recently coming from a particularly difficult to pronounce German word, Einfühlung, that of Ein, which is in, and Fühlung, feeling. This came from 1858, a German philosopher, Rudolf Lotze, as a translation of the Greek empathia, passion, state of emotion. Essentially, this was a term used for art appreciation. There's an interesting concept right there. The idea of actually making a word that you're describing the connection of actually caring and respect and understanding, knowing and understanding the feelings both of oneself and someone else didn't seem to really come into the vernacular in English till about a century ago. And that's an interesting concept right there. It's showing right there that there was an absence for a very long time in people actually having some type of vernacular to use to show the levels of respect that's being generated or desired.
Well, I also noticed that it contains the Greek word pathos, which has to do with feeling. So feelings are how we think or feel about that which we encounter in reality. So these things about using philosophy to identify that which exists and be conscious and use the law of identity that we've talked about in past episodes comes together now in this next step of actually connecting with someone else, listening to what they have to say, processing the words that they're using, and carefully selecting the words that you're going to use in return, to not necessarily have a debate or argument, but to have a discussion, to have a conversation, to add on to that which is already there and to find something new from the result.
Yeah, we're jumping ahead into some of these later concepts, but it's true. There is that aspect of connection. And so I think it's very important just to not assume that everyone who's watching this, certainly because it's going to reach the broader audience way beyond the people who are familiar with your history presentations, what is the trivium? What is the method of critical thinking that we are often referring to? I think that would be very fundamental right there. So if I could just quickly go over that in my own brief way, I would say this. I first learned of the Trivium Method of critical thinking before I began studying NVC, or nonviolent communication. And this helped me immeasurably in seeing which parts of nonviolent communication were more tactically applicable. So the Trivium Method of critical thinking goes over first grammar, which is essentially knowledge, or who, what, where, and when. This is the data. This is the very basics of information. Next would be coming logic, which is essentially the removal of contradiction. There's a beautiful, beautiful list of the informal logical fallacies, which are used as little flags to make a little tiny mental warning note that maybe your data might be corrupted. This is as answering the question of why, essentially. That's one part of it. And then comes rhetoric, the practical applications of grammar and the logic. This is the practical applications of who, what, where, when, and why. And that means essentially the communication aspect, also the action aspect. This also has a large part of that is the rhetorical triangle, an aspect of that, which is the author, the person who's making the message, as well as the audience who is intended to receive the message. And this is surrounded by context. So that's quick. That is the Trivium Method. It's the rhetoric is finally the answer of how. Essentially, it gives you the practical application. And also, rhetoric is wisdom. And as something I've heard folks say before, if it's not practical, it is not wisdom. It's very simple. So this is an intellectual lens. I want to emphasize that right now. This is an intellectual method of focusing the mind. And what I was seeing was many people using this method to try and attempt to communicate and see if they could cross the bridge between themselves and another individual who may be coming from completely different viewpoints. And there were obviously key pieces of grammar or knowledge missing. And this is what nonviolent communication helped me identify. But first, Rich, I think it would be best if I just quickly give you an update on what nonviolent communication is, that is, and all of the people watching along. Nonviolent communication was discovered by Marshall Rosenberg. He essentially invented this. He himself was a student of the methods of Carl Rogers. So he began to codify the foundational aspects in 1972. I just, by the by, that's exactly when I was born. He was putting this together using the format of observations, feelings, and action-oriented wants, as in something that you desire. Then eventually, by 1972, he had codified this into the main aspects that it's known today: observations, feelings, needs, and requests. So I can just quickly tell you what OFNR, observations, feelings, needs, requests, refers to. It's the foundation of this tactical science of communication. Observations are strictly without evaluation. It's the grammar of the situation, like a video camera would take in. There's no evaluations. It's just the pure data. And then there would be feelings. These are the emotions of all tangible people who are involved in communicating. So in case of the rhetorical triangle, that's the author and the audience. What are their feelings? This is information. It's subjective. Unlike observations, which are tangible and measurable, feelings are subjective and they are rather abstract. So there's a list of these words which be beautiful for people to learn, perhaps maybe even giving them a nice picture to look at quickly of the list of all of the feelings for those people who aren't literate or quickly, explicitly knowledgeable of all of the feelings. Then comes needs. And this is a jargon word which I prefer to call motivating factors. Essentially, what Marshall Rosenberg did was he connected feelings with motivating factors that are values and desires. And, as with a child, needs. These are the fundamental things that are the genesis of all emotions. These are also abstract, and that is a very important thing to keep in mind, that these needs or motivating factors are abstractions. They contain no nouns or proper nouns. They have nothing to do with a strategy. We're coming to that in a moment. The final aspect is requests, and this refers to actionable strategies, including words and communication, and also you can have kinetic requests or kinetic actions, that is something that happens right away, or potential ones where you're making a plan of action. So what we have here is two different splits of information. The observations and the requests or tangible actions, those are tangible. Then we have feelings and the motivating factors or needs. Those are intangible. They are abstract and they are concepts. They are not perceptions. When you have a feeling, I just want to say this one more time, a feeling is perceivable internally. You can feel various things going on, but what you're feeling is actually observations. You're kind of taking note of internal things going on in your mind, in your body usually. But what's actually going on, the actual name of the feeling, is an abstraction. And as you mentioned before, Rich, the reason why we communicate is to make wonderful things happen, or to create something, or to connect to someone. So this is a science of connection. And if you learned this much of nonviolent communication, you learn to speak in this type of a sentence. When you do fill in the blank with an observation, I feel whatever emotion because my need for, fill in the need list of your motivating factor, because my need for blank is not being met. Would you be willing to insert request so that my need for blank can be met? It can sound a little clunky like that. It sounds a bit robotic, and
can I
that's
try
why
it?
Many people are.
Can I try it in its robotics, robotic sense? If you were speaking too loud, this is just my example. When you speak too loud, I feel off balance because my need for hearing you clearly is not being met. Would you be willing to turn down the gain on your microphone so that my need to hear you clearly and take notes can be met, right? So that's my example. Your mic's not too loud, but I was just trying to help the audience envision how it can be practically applicable in their lives. Please continue.
Thank you so much. I was really worried about the mic for a second there.
I do want to interject quickly and just say, I like the fact you call it a tactile science of communication, in a way, a science and an art, because like we just stated here, trying to use an example, that's where the sort of individual artistic idea of how you can express it, even though there's these tangible concepts, or we're going over the OFNR, observation, feelings, needs, and requests, the main foundation of NVC. There's still an art to how you actually use words to build that bridge of connection with other individuals. And admittedly so, at Tragedy and Hope, we really only studied grammar and logic in depth and really went into the heart and core of the trivium. But we never really truly looked at different rhetorical vehicles for communication. And this would be one of the first ones I think we're trying to espouse here.
And if I might interject before Darrell continues with his fine conversation that's enlightening to everybody, I just want to bring it back so we have an anchor to reality. What we're talking about is a convection current of objective and subjective. The subjective is using the trivium in your mind, how to think, but it's the objective of how do you communicate your thoughts into reality? How do you take this action to choose the words properly? And in this convection current, I want to note that there's 3 parts, and we've only been given 0 parts really through schooling. It's how to read, how to think, and how to speak. they teach us how to read, but only halfway. They teach us to read, but not to question. And the questioning is what leads into the thinking. And if you're not thinking about what you're reading, you don't have anything interesting to really say. So these three things that all go together, the rhetorical triangle and the trivium, are all different, but they all have an interplay in our needs, in our primary motivations to have our needs met. Darrell, please continue since I'm done interrupting and adding that context. Thank you.
My pleasure. Yeah, what I wanted to just mention right here is that when you go through the trivium, this is very important, you learn to have a bunch of different scanning mechanisms running after you've started playing with this tool for more than a year plus. And one of those tools is called grammar scan, something I would call it that. That is where any use of a particular piece of word or grammar is suddenly flagged if you have them flagged for certain things. For example, myself, my grammar scan goes off whenever I hear a first-person plural pronoun, such as, "We are stopping all the children from learning these things." And I'm thinking, no, I'm not. I'm not part of that we. I know what you were trying to say. I can translate that in my head. But I also know how that's conflated. In other words, it can be equivocated or confused for meaning something utterly else, meaning a part of obligation or responsibility, which we're getting to. So that's one part of it. The informal logical fallacies, which hopefully anyone who's spent any amount of time at Tragedy and Hope or looking deeper into the trivium, hopefully you already know of this list. Many folks who have come to this video, you also know of the informal logical fallacies. You came to it from a different direction. These are wonderful tools internally, quietly, to be used as a method to judge whether or not there is possibly someone who is fooled themselves or who is trying to fool you, which occasionally does happen. So this is very important in the same thing. The missing grammar or information was often the actual feelings and the motivating factors that are the genesis of those feelings for all communicating individuals. That is the piece of crucial information right there. But here's the thing. There's 4 other concepts very important to nonviolent communication. These are called the 4 Ds of disconnected communication. They are perfect ways to cause a barrier of actual caring and respect and empathy. If you use all 4, you can guarantee that you can cause a complete lack of any connection, and that, of course, will slow down any logic or understanding. So what we have first is demands. These are actually something that is equivocated or confused as an actual demand. It's the opposite of making a request. In a request, you can take it or leave it, or choose something else or modify it. In a demand, it's very blatant, such as, "I demand you turn down the gain on your mic." That's very blatant. Or, "Turn down your mic, Darrell." That's a demand. That's very simple. A diagnosis, that's unrequested. This is very important. These are the unasked for labels, adjectives, words that are basically not really important, not usually useful. They put things into a box. They're usually conceptual. Most important, they're not requested. An unrequested diagnosis is another way of causing a barrier or some type of disconnection between people. There's deserve-oriented language, the 3rd D. These are words used to imply or describe some extrinsic motivating factor, such as punishments and rewards. "Darrell, you did a great job in dressing up in a suit for the interview, so there you go. You get your reward, and we'll put this on YouTube." Or, "You ought to be locked up. Look at that hair." That's, essentially some type of punishment, also a mixture of a diagnosis. Then there's denial of responsibility. Now, deserve-oriented language and denial of responsibility are essentially, whether implied or explicit, they are abdication of responsibility, or the ability to respond is what I mean by responsibility. This is different than an obligation. This means that it's an opportunity to respond, the ability to respond, and then there's the lack of it. Denial of responsibility, "You made me so mad I had to yell at you, so it's your fault." That's a small example of that. These are methods that are disconnecting. It's very difficult to use NVC really well when you don't have an explicit or instant internal knowledge of these four methods. That's the 4Ds, and yeah, then we can. I'm going to wait to see if you have any observations on this, Rich or Tony.
Well, my observations would be that it's useful to avoid ambiguity by carefully choosing your words, and you get better at it as you practice it as a habit. It develops, and like you say, or as you observed, practicing it over many years' time gives you greater skill. It's not something you're going to get right away, but you can get started right away. The unrequested diagnosis, if once you understand that you are doing this or that you are expressing yourself in an involuntary way to others, then you can start to be conscious of that and select your words. And it's also important to revisit the goal of why we communicate with each other, because a lot of times I think people are just taking their feelings from one stress in life, inventing them, in another way on the internet, and these things aren't progressive or helpful, and you've seen a lot of this in the 9/11 truth movement over the past 10 years. People who just don't know how to get anything done because they can't get on the same page to start. And it starts with philosophy, it starts with thinking, but then it continues with your speaking. And it all is made possible because of our five senses and our ability to observe and to feel.
And I would just like
Tony?
to say that we're first and foremost emotional creatures, and it's a way we use words to relate to certain emotions. And I find it very interesting because we all relate to love or fear, anxiety or peace, and by going through different life experiences. And although these emotions, these feelings are subjective in nature, there is a sort of universal quality that's applicable to all individuals. And I was just wondering if you could kind of comment on that kind of aspect, because this kind of convection current, as Rich had already stated before.
Well, I mean, if I might interrupt you, Tony, it's the continued use of our culture's implementation of jackal language. This is what Rosenberg calls it. He calls it jackal language, but when you understand what the jackal is and what type of language that is, it's pretty amusing. And once you laugh at it, then you can stop administering it through your communication with other people, because if it's not on your radar, you can't do anything about it. So as we continue to grow and learn, we learn about new things and things that we need to change or improve. And I think that's what you're talking about, the convection current of input, processing, and output. This is the rhetoric. This is the third step in the trivium. This is about the output in communication. But again, it depends on the first two parts and observation. Observation, identification, and then the logic processing. That's all implicit. And then the explicit, external, objective is communication. Writing, speaking, any other form of communication that people are participating in these days. So Darrell, could you first define jackal language and then maybe give us some examples that we've already done to you in this conversation where we've applied it inappropriately?
You guys have been pretty polite, I would say, but I could definitely give you examples in general. Those four parts where, for example, someone is making an actual demand and saying, Darrell, I'm running a half hour late, so you're going to be running a half hour late. And so anyway, be ready in a half hour. And that can come off as kind of a demand thing. And you could have something to the effect of, you really need to take care of that feedback there. And basically that's another demand. You could basically be making a diagnosis of, I don't know, I think you're kind of woo-woo out there with your study of Oriental medicine and acupuncture, and that sounds a bit like a diagnosis. It's, you're kind of giving me a label there with calling me woo-woo and such. That this is an example of something that can happen. I have seen this, certainly. And the applications of denial of responsibility, this is very important right here. I think a lot of the people who are so adamant about the power of the concepts of liberty and who spend so much time studying the very many methods of tyranny or coercive control, they're very, very excited about these ideas, and they also see the value in personally taking 100% responsibility for all of their own financial situations, for their own life situations. they're almost at the point where they're ready to take 100% responsibility for their emotional situations. More of them are ready. As I'm hoping this summer with the Liberty Festival going on over there in New Hampshire, the Porcupine Freedom Festival, I'm hoping that there's more and more people who are coming together to see the value in also taking responsibility for your own internal emotional situation. So the deserve-oriented language, that of you're doing great, you've done a good job, so you deserve a reward, or you don't deserve that. The punishments, rewards, the extrinsic motivating factors, and the very blatant denial of responsibility. I couldn't hold it together because he was rude at me during the debate, so I just had to go off on him. This is the kind of thing that can happen, that people, they don't see the need for, or the power that can happen when you take internal control. But here's the thing, without the knowledge of connecting that internal feeling with some value or desire, and here's the part where I would certainly take a deep look at the list of needs, as they're called in NVC jargon, which I personally prefer motivating factors. I think that that's the part right there. It's the internal knowledge of these aspects. Jackal language is demands, diagnoses, deserve-oriented language, and denial of responsibility. There are fancier word lists that they're called the evaluative word list. We'll certainly be sharing the link for that one. This is useful because it gives a beautiful breakdown of the potential feelings and the potential motivating factors for any individual who might choose to wield these words. This is Jackal language in a nutshell, whether explicit, such as the 4 Ds, or fancy, such as the evaluative word list. It comes down to this. It is the internal application of all of this information together, consistency intellectually, consistency empathetically with connection. First, the practitioner learns to use all of these tools internally. How am I observing the situation? What am I feeling? What's going on in me? Why am I feeling that little bit of tension right here? Oh, I see. Because I'm dressed up, but it's the tropics and it's actually quite warm here. That's why I feel that, yeah. And then, okay, what am I going to do? This is all done internally. After this all set's breaking down, I'm going to go back to my beautiful tropic attire to match the tropics that I live in. And I'll be okay. And this is all done silently, internally for the NVC practitioner. The next step is all of that becomes tabled. That's like the adult taking care of the inner child. All that is done, then you can pay attention to the outer world. That's, who is this person I'm talking to? What is Richard Grove? And what's going on with him emotion-wise? And I can gain that from choices of words and body language and facial expression. And I can use that to guess which types of motivating factors are going on within this individual. I can start seeing things. This is part of the grammar, the feelings and the motivating factors. And from there, the strategy of the person starts to make more sense. And with this knowledge comes the power. You begin to see the motivating factors. With all of this together comes the ability to cause a connection, which I'll be getting to too. That'll be one of the next steps.
Why is it important to start with the internal observations of your feelings and as juxtaposed to the external focus and the rhetoric that people apply?
Very good question, Tony. You see, this is one of the problems with some styles of people learning or teaching nonviolent communication, is they could, instead of looking at it as an internal, beautiful application, they begin to think that they can jump right into using it as a communication tactic without doing the work. It's important because if you are not aware of grammar, I'm speaking, if you're not aware of the information of what specifically are emotions that are going on internally, if you're not aware of what motivates those emotions, then you are missing information. The fallacy of the neglected aspect, that's on the intellectual side, if you wanted to look at it that way. If I was going to say there's 4 major flavors of fallacy that I'm often looking at intellectually, that's one of them, but the other ones are the fallacies of relevance, the fallacies of ambiguity, the fallacies of equivocation or confusion. But the fallacy of the neglected aspect is what we're dealing with here. It's the knowledge of this information helps the individual understand whether they're being motivated internally or the motivation is external. Now,
How does that work?
I want to say one more thing. I'm sorry. Just martial arts know this. Martial artists who are very prominent in their skill, they know this because they practice the internal skill, such as Qigong, first and foremost and prominently. The internal energy is harvested or cultivated and grown. Then they can do the external exhibition, the external applications. It's always that way. And every single person who does this knows if you've not done the internal work, your external form is very weak. And that's the way I wanted to explain it with that metaphor.
That's a good metaphor, because essentially just going to ask, how does that work with, an individual's ability to respond or responsibility in this one case? Because the idea is if we can analyze our own feelings and motivating factors, we can then better understand when we are externally expressing to other individuals our intentions and these sorts of ideas. So I just wanted to kind of clarify the internal and external a bit more. It's very, very good.
Well, now you're coming back to things that John Taylor Gatto has mentioned in the Ultimate History Lesson and in his books about the active literacies and learning what motivates people. Several different theories of human motivation is what he was teaching those kids so that they could go out and have access to individuals of influence and power and get things done in the world. Because if you don't know those keys, you really are subservient to a slave system, because the children of the elite are being taught a whole different skill set of how to interact with people, how to think for themselves, how to read a book, for instance, and how to communicate to get to satisfy their primary motivations, which sometimes are in conflict with our needs for survival, which is one of the reasons that we find this a necessary it's a necessary course of thought to consider how you take in information, how you process information, and how you output information. And if you aren't working on all three of these areas simultaneously, you're gonna, it's gonna be more like a triangle than a wheel that can roll consistently and go through this process of input, processing, and output. You would use this process thousands of times a day if you apply it properly to each and everything that you're doing. But most people, they think of it, then they go a couple days and they think of it and they might use it, or, so it's about the consistent application of these methods and tools that we're trying to get a grasp on at this time. Otherwise, you could create cognitive dissonance. Darrell, how does OFNR create cognitive dissonance or dissipate cognitive dissonance?
Well, I'm not sure about the causing cognitive dissonance. I think it does cause that if you have some neglected aspect, it's true. Such as the neglected aspect of what's going on internally, but then you're using OFNR, or your observations, feelings, needs, requests, externally. And it is similar to the neglected aspects intellectually, but it comes down to that one part right there. There is the desire to have that 100% responsibility when you follow along, at least the way I've been training for the last couple of years. 100% responsibility is one thing to say in terms of your own emotions and in terms of what it is that generates that emotion, the values and desires that you have going on within you, the values and desires that you generated years and years ago, or maybe even recently. That's the one part that's just an understood thing right there. If you have that information, you can have a connection. If you're missing that information, Rich, then you could have a disconnection. That's one way that it happens. But here's the thing. You could have 100% responsibility, or the ability to respond, taking full advantage of this opportunity to empower yourself with understanding what's going on so much internally. But you can still understand cause and effect externally, that there are actualities of cause and effect. You can have real boundaries created within you and boundaries that you can express between other individuals. And there's a cause and effect. For example, there are well-armed people over in New Hampshire. There is a cause and effect if you go over there and go into their houses uninvited. It's nothing personal. It's just a cause and effect over there. So this is the same thing with people, and if you have 100% control of your own emotions, or at least you're aiming for equilibrium, you're aiming for that, you have that ability to figure it out. whoa, what he just said just took me off. That throws me. Why is that? Because I had this desire for coming off so much more clearly than the way I've been expressing myself. And so I felt that tension, those feelings came up because of the desire. As soon as that is understood, you can take steps in your own mind. There's the empowerment right there. It's very important to understand, most people we communicate to, they're not going to do this. They're not going to take 100% responsibility. So there is the idea that you understand you're communicating to individuals who abdicate their responsibility, and you're communicating to individuals who have not studied the Trivium Method of critical thinking, not even in the least, not even the logical fallacy lists. So this is part of understanding the person. Where are they coming from with their emotions? But here's the other part. In knowing the Trivium Method, you get to also understand, how does this other person form their logic? Perhaps they have an appeal to an authority or some type of circular reasoning, and they just keep drawing upon it to basically hit upon the conclusions that they wish to emphasize. This is important to them. There's an attempt made to respect the perspective of the other person, to demonstrate an accepting and permissive attitude towards the autonomy for them to choose as they wish. And there comes cause and effect again. There is a cause and effect of, if their choice crosses over into my choice, it's very important to establish one's boundaries. At the same time, we're looking to create connection, because this whole first part of this presentation is about connection. We'll get to the ramifications of that, hopefully.
I would just
Go ahead, Tony.
I was just going to say, Darrell, a lot of the fallacies that you're bringing up that we mentioned through the Trivium study that we've done, a lot of these relate to emotional splinters, a metaphor we might use later on, that we relate back to. This idea that they're all, and Jan Irvin recently interviewed a man by the name of Dave Asprey, who interestingly enough mentioned the idea that we respond emotionally to situations before the rational mind has a time to kick in. And there's a measurable effect behind that idea, which is why the idea and power of emotions is so important when understanding how we tie emotions to words, which is where I think NVC has such value. Because a lot of these fallacies that we keep bringing up really just relate to sort of emotional splinters, and maybe you can go into that metaphor a little bit.
Well, and before you do, I also want to comment, because what Dave Asprey is describing is a stimulus-response relationship in people's minds, and it's the absence of thinking. It has to do with the schooling system and the media that reinforces it. But the important thing to think about is the stimulus-response relationship is a form of slavery or control. It negates your individual input or your thought. And in between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is your freedom, because that's your choice in that space to think or not to think. Don't just go outsource that and say, I assume I'm not going to need to think, so I'm just going to go stimulus response and go with my gut feelings. Your gut feelings are formed on your experiences, observations, judgments, conclusions that you've reached before, which comes back to what you both were observing, that when you interact with somebody, you have to understand, is their metric for truth reality, objective reality, or is it authority? Have they been programmed to think they know things without actually asking questions? Somebody gave them a bunch of declarative sentences in a fancy history book, and there it is. There you go. That's schooling, and now you know everything you need to know. Go out and be an interchangeable cog in the corporate machine.
The freedom is a sort of observation of those internal motivations. So those observations of emotions, first and foremost, allow us to take different action, have a different volition, a willingness to choose a different path and way we'll relate to other individuals.
Great. This goes right into the first metaphor I wanted to cover. These splinters of the mind. These are aspects of disconnection within the individual. I would rather just say these are aspects within all individual. What I'm describing first are basically emotional splinters. These are emotionally based wounds of sorts, where there's an actual emotional reaction, a disconnection, a very stimulus, emotion, pre-programmed response, as you just described, Rich. And then, of course, there's the intellectual splinters. Those are the various types of informal logical fallacies. We have various large lists of them. We have smaller lists of them. These are components. And let me tell you why I'm using this as a metaphor first. I chose splinters because everyone has had splinters that I know of. And most people look upon splinters as something that is not shameful. It is not permanent. It's not a bomb going off in your brain. It is merely just an event that happens. It happens to everyone. There is a respect for someone who has splinters. You don't want to touch a splinter. The touching of a splinter in these types of mental and emotional events that happen is tantamount to what we would call cognitive dissonance, the aspect of a disconnect where there is an actual verifiable emotional response, and then there's an effort made to downplay, to fight or flight, to run away or to fight, that aspect of disconnection within the individual. Splinters are the kind of things that I try to identify without touching. Touching a splinter intellectually or emotionally happens in a conversation, and this is part of understanding. It's the missing grammar. This is the exciting part. This is the opportunity here. We have the tools now to use these methods, to look deeper, to see what is motivating a person, and to understand it, whether it's an intellectual fallacy that they rely upon to try to ascertain reality, something wherein they wish for your help with it. They're often wishing for you to support them in whatever that particular notion is. And then there are the emotional responses, where they're also, I would say, more implied, crying out for help of a sort, in one way or another. So this is very important to understand this, to see it, first of all, to see it within oneself. What are the splinters? What are there? And then what's going on with this other person that I'm speaking to? It's quite a powerful tool.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes when we touch upon these splinters in conversations with other individuals, people have a tendency to over-rationalize where these fallacies are presented. And this is just from this intellectual lens we're using, draw upon a metaphor you said earlier about the trivium. But I like the idea of just being conscious of the observation in that moment. It's that observation in that moment that allows for the opportunity to take a different pathway, to find a connection rather than to continue pushing down on the splinter. And people have a tendency to continuously over-rationalize. So although we have the stimulus response model, within that stimulus response model, they actually rationalize that behavior, that emotion, or that idea, unfortunately, many times over, because the rational mind kicks in right after the emotional response. So it becomes a sort of tricky situation when engaging with individuals when they have these sort of lofty argumentations they're presenting, when in fact what we're trying to do is just find a different way to build a bridge, rather than to continually push down on the splinter that is causing them pain.
I've got one more thing to add about the splinters. For most people that I know of, it would be considered rather rude to try to reach out and pull out someone's physical splinter. This is another reason I chose this metaphor. This is important because I see people wanting to reach out and show people their own use of an informal logical fallacy. That's a common example I'm seeing. They wish to go out and touch it and remove it. It must be purely voluntary and usually often internal. The removal of splinters is a very personal event. Now I'm here and I'll be telling you right now, I am all open to hearing all about any particular splinters that any of you can find in myself and in any of my essays or my audio work. But most people are not going to give you that explicit permission. Most people, it's going to be the height of rudeness or disconnection, a lack of respect is going to happen. A barrier to understanding will happen if you try to touch upon these events going on within them, whether intellectually or emotionally. That's the last part of why the splinters. The next and kind of relevant metaphor is the bridge of empathy. This is the actual palpable connection, the respect, that very important value and desire that most people have, where there is an actual level of caring and understanding back and forth between each individual. This is what allows people to communicate, but first they need this bridge of empathy, and I made it a very special bridge. It's an amazingly magical one because you can't go across this bridge by being forced to or forcing someone else across the bridge. You can't pull someone else across it. It has to only be crossed voluntarily, only works that way. That's what makes it very interesting. use it purely as a metaphor, it is the bridge of empathy. It is understanding. It is respect. And this is very important. What I want to put on the bridge is my logic, the cargo going back and forth across the bridge. That is what I'm wishing to send. And one very important piece of the logic is, why am I having this conversation? What is the purpose? That would be an important little piece to go with the truck of logic that I'm sending over the bridge. Now, you can imagine the difficulty in various debates and angry discussions that I'm sure you've read and listened to and watched, where people have no connection, obviously, to caring about each other, and yet they're hurling these trucks of logic across this chasm of water between these two islands, these individuals. And obviously the trucks are landing in rather bad shape, and they're not really taking any time to look inside the truck, and there's no looking at the manifest of what the logic cargo was. And they're not usually taking anything from that damaged cargo in the first place because there's no connection. The purpose of making a bridge of empathy is so that the cargo of information, of logic, the rational mind can go across. That is the gist of it. And I did use the metaphor of the 18-wheelers of logic, but it could just as well as be any type of cargo. It's essentially, you need a road to put the cargo on first. That was the way I was thinking. And the first step would be building the bridge. The second step would be sending the cargo, not sending the cargo and then thinking after the fact of, I really could have used a bridge there.
Not the logic before the grammar, as I've heard many times before. But, you mentioned this word voluntary. How important is it to respect someone's autonomous space and allow them to sort of build a voluntary relationship on both sides? I think that has a direct connection with the idea of building the bridge together.
It's only important if you want to have any type of connection at all. That's basically why I covered the 4 Ds of disconnection, is any amount of that type of coercion, whether making a demand or basically making and giving an unwanted diagnosis, any type of denying responsibility when actually it is within one's responsibility to understand and to be in control of one's own emotions. If you are an adult, I'm assuming, then each of these are aspects of it. Now, people will basically, I'd love to get a lovely, devil's advocate type question of, well, but in this instance, he really made me feel this. You can hear my New York accent come out.
I can actually present a devil's advocate position if you would like.
Please.
Professor Umpleby. Rich, what was the title of that presentation he gave? Is it the cybernetics of language, or?
It was a cybernetics conversation that he had in front of a class that's like 6 hours long. It came on a DVD. They put it on YouTube, and I was like one of the only people to watch it. We all watched it together, Tony, Kevin, and I, and we went through, and he basically says at one point, I know this is irrational, and I know this is a fallacy, but don't worry about it. And he continues on with his theory. And basically, there
are 2 concepts, right? And then the 2 concepts were how to communicate with these 2 different types of individuals. And the idea is actually getting to their level. Like if an individual is actually angry, you want to respond angrily. But if an individual actually is very peaceful and reserved, you want to respond reserved. And this is some sort of measurable cybernetic idea that's employed amongst some of the highest elite of understanding language arts and applying it in business world and military and other sorts of positions, which is very interesting because there seems to be a much more creative and innovative way to communicate. However, in this presentation, and unfortunately I forget the exact concepts, but this sort of idea where they apply symbols to this meta language where they step outside and they try to view each conversation objectively and independently, and how best to communicate with individuals in those sorts of situations that seem to respond differently to different stimulus almost.
Yeah, Umpleby was a student of Heinz von Forster, one of the famous 20th century cyberneticians, and we'll be doing an episode on that in the future, analyzing that presentation, and possibly have Professor Umpleby on as a guest. So we'll table that, and we'll continue with going through the logic of communicating compassionately, with empathy, and in such a way that we're not putting our logic before our grammar. In other words, we're checking our premises first. We're doing the thinking before we formulate words to communicate with other people. And that is necessary, that we add our own individual value from the thoughts we have in between the stimulus and response, because otherwise we're not communicating about anything of substance by definition.
Yes, and I think it's very important to understand that it is very crucial to know the goal. Many people are communicating and they're not making explicit what is the goal of the communication. If the goal was actually to have the other person say that they are wrong, there is likely to be a problem, because the goal is a specific strategy. And so that means that the person is not actually aware of what it is behind the strategy. In other words, what's their motivating factor for choosing that particular action or that strategy. Because to have a specific individual say that they are wrong about something is a specific strategy. They are not obviously aware of what is motivating them to desire this in the first place, unless they are aware of what motivates them to desire this. And if they are, when you look at that list of these values and desires, you see that there's many ways of doing this. There are many ways. This gets into the whole aspect of the language of obligation, and I'm going to juxtapose that with the language of choice. I'll give you a few examples of these, both use of language and actual concepts. So an obligation word would be should, and I would instead often be replacing that in my mind with prefer to, and must or need to, and I replace that in my mind with decide to. I decide to, and ought to, and I mean I shall choose to, and right and wrong and moral and immoral, and I replace that in my mind with individually preferable, individually less preferable. And then there are extrinsically created rights, which I basically understand as intrinsically generated respect of other individual choices and my own individual choice. You see, it comes down to that aspect Tony touched on. Those that are coercive situations goes into the realm of the obligatory. Those that are voluntary situations that go into the realm of choice and respect. There's the aspect of win-lose or lose-lose, where you basically have one person wins the debate, one person loses the debate, or in some instances, they both end up looking like an ass. And then there's the win-win engineering, where people are doing the and also, and I've got this perspective. Also, I've got this perspective. Hey, let's put them together. This is opposite to the debate where you have either or. It's a very scarcity-minded perspective. So the good thing about the abundance perspective, which is what I've been promoting in the use of these two tools of consistent intellectual and consistent empathetic skills, is that it is an abundance perspective. It includes other people's choice to use the scarcity perspective. Other people can choose to use this. You can let them do so. It is, in fact, very important and I would say crucial to see what it is that they're actually after. If they can't see what motivates them, then at least we can. This is the choice. We being those of us who are watching, you, all of us here. This is what I mean by it, going over these two types of language. I think there could be a lot more fleshed out in this, but these are some of them, and I have about 8 different tactics to get into, but I'm ready to take some more observations and questions at this point.
Well, one of the things that I'm observing over here on my end is there is an abundance of tools that are useful. It takes time to learn them, and this is kind of what we've been doing at Tragedy and Hope, one of the many things that we do in the community. So these are useful skills that are substantial and helps to move your choice back into your realm of choice making instead of outsourcing it, because it's the selection of words that we use in our own thoughts about ourselves that leads, to either impedances and creativity, curiosity, self-esteem, self-reliance, etc., or opens that up. And once that opens up, because you're using the right thoughts in your head that are accurate and non-judgmental and aren't and aren't obligatory, then it transforms through your actions with other people, because only once you use these thoughts in your own mind can you express them and help other people to find their way as well. The other tool that I found useful, because there's an abundance of tools. There's not just Marshall Rosenberg's book, Nonviolent Communication, which Darrell admittedly has never read. He studied the tactics online and didn't have to go by the book. But there's also some videos on YouTube by a woman named Byron Katie, who has these set of questions that that you can ask yourself to help train yourself to use kind and gentle thoughts in your own head, and don't think of yourself as an idiot or always being incompetent or any of these things that society finds beneficial if you are a person who can't be self-reliant, who has to spend a bunch of money to get your self-esteem and self-confidence in their conspicuous consumption. Don't participate in that. Try to wean yourself off of that by slowly learning habits that are healthy for your mind that no one can ever take away. Even, if they want to come to your house and take everything else, great. I have my experience, knowledge. I know how to get things done. I know how to solve problems. I know how to communicate with other people. I can survive. And so you're at a place where you always are re-upping your hope instead of depleting it all the time, because you have these actual skills, even if you can't master them right away. What can you master right away in the world? Instant gratification is not all it's cracked up to be. So once you start building these skill sets in yourself over time, then you're really able to learn more depth to each skill set. But I advise people to just be, there I am using obligatory language again. Should people prefer to or decide to look, there is a copious cornucopia of tools available for both mind and communication, as well as input. So it's input, processing, and output, and there's tools for everything, and that's what we're all about. That's one of our goals in communicating tonight, and I at least feel satisfied because I have put that out there to the world, and people can do whatever they want.
I mean, I wanted to throw in there, although I'm wanting to hear what you say soon, Tony, but I have actually started cracking Marshall Rosenberg's book, but it is true. How I learned this was first going through podcasts where I would have the essentials of this broken down for me. And I heard other people utilize this, and I was shaking my head because they were utilizing that thing that a lot of folks I work with call robot giraffe, which is when they're speaking externally, they aren't doing the internal work, they are directly speaking of the observations, feelings, needs, requests. And after some time, they gain quite the literacy of feelings and needs. They're able to really identify them and connect the dots there. But there's a lack of explicit knowledge of the 4 Ds of disconnected communication. And so they utilize those 4 Ds here and there, subtly or unfortunately not so subtly. And that was the problem that I was seeing right there. So yes, more recently I started cracking a copy of NVC and looking to see how quickly does Marshall give these skills. Not very quickly. I certainly was able to pump them out in about 5 pages or less. And that's precisely what I was aiming to do. But let me tell you how I got here first, which is I have been working for more than a year with an online Google Plus community where we'd be able to, for free, video chat up to 10 of us every week, sometimes multiple times per week, covering these concepts in a casual atmosphere, going over the situations, all of these people having for many years, some very deep desire to understand the value of freedom, liberty, and some sets of value of the study of tyrannical control methods. And they certainly would see the difference between the 2 aspects of what is coercive and what is voluntary, such as the way we choose our boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife situation, which hopefully for all of you folks watching and listening was voluntary, or at least pleasant. And then there's the other aspects of what is coercive, such as the way most of us would be feeling about paying taxes. That was not so much of an open choice. So it comes down to these 2 aspects, that of understanding it externally, and then going and taking it internally, and then working at it. And with people, and with working over and over again, this is where the skill was gained. This is where the language of obligation was isolated and where the language of choice, as you're picking up, Rich, was starting to be isolated. Now I'm really curious, Tony, what were you about to interject?
You mentioned so many concepts in between that I have other questions now. And a lot of my questions go back to this abundance versus scarcity model, language of obligation versus, or in juxtaposition to the language of choice. And it's interesting because I guess the umpleby, what I was trying to get across is like, yeah, I didn't really think of it in the terms of strategies. Some individuals have a certain strategy of the way they're going to communicate and what they're going to listen to. That's sort of language of obligation. A scarcity or an artificial scarcity kind of creates this either or situation, this top-down hierarchical situation, which many times people become sort of feel a course of nature engaging with. But we don't, recognize the sort of abstract ideas, these only in the mind itself, these concepts and how they actually relate, because we almost use this without thinking about it. It's something Rich even mentioned. He's like, I'm using this obligatory language that even I advise people. But in this case, it's something that it's very subtle, but these subtleties are very powerful when we decide to observe and actually, just as the Trivium states, even as a different form, intellectual end, this observation, this perceptual stage, and making explicit those perceptions helps, in naming them, really helps to be able to work through these different techniques that are available to us to make an abundance perspective or language of choice, which will then actually translates into actions of abundance. It's not just a language of abundance. It's that you can take actions then that are not in direct conflict with our motivating factors anymore. Because just by the language we choose to employ, we end up manifesting our actions a little bit differently. And I think that subtlety is very powerful. It's something that small abstraction, that just those concepts are just very powerful to the actions we actually tangibly end up taking in life.
Well, and I think once we attach words to the things we're trying to describe, we've put a handle on it, and that's the grammar. It's the individual parts. And you take those words and you put them together in a sentence. Declarative sentence is it's an argument. You have clear terms, true premises, and a valid argument. That's a good declarative sentence. That's what you're supposed to be sending over this bridge in the 18-wheeler, is here's a bunch of words put together that are logically and objectively valid that you can use and depend on because I'm a reliable source of information. So bringing this all together, Darrell, what are some of the, not ramifications, what are some of the benefits of using nonviolent communication tactics and strategies along with a Trivium method of consistently thinking through what you want to say before you do it?
The first benefit is you begin, once you've established an actual bridge of empathy, some palpable recognition of respect, is that you've gained that. You've gained an actual recognition of respect. You begin to have that. Second, you have an understanding of what the splinters are, and you're not purposefully touching them. And that goes a long way to maintaining the respect. And with that understanding, then you can actually deliver information that cannot touch those splinters. Meaning, that means collaboration, innovation, creativity can occur. When you have deeper connection, this is what the possibility is. I think what we're seeing is a lot of like-minded people are coming together. They're seeing the value in some of these concepts, and they are innovating. They are coming up with businesses and new services, new products. They are seeing what is tyranny. And these people are excellent at measuring tyrannical methods. They're just brilliant at it. And with that measurement and the emotions that come along with such measurement, they took the time to bear witness internally to what's happened. The anger, the frustration, the anxiety, the concern, the fear, the grief at the lost opportunity, which is sadness of what could have been had these tyrannical situations not occurred. This has all been bared witness to, and then with a clear mind, more of the adult mind, since the child is always there inside of us. That's the part that we're really feeling things. The adult mind can then make strategies that are more collaborative. That's one of the most important aspects right there. I think we can come up with a few ideas right here of how people saw the tyrannical aspects of the legacy banking system, and people started coming up with ways of collaborating to come together to create cryptocurrencies, units of exchange, where basically, anonymous bits of information could be passed back and forth. And now with bit message, information could be passed back and forth. And there doesn't have to be much of a trace or that much of the tyrannical aspect. The one part that I didn't put in the list of obligatory language is monopoly. And I mean by that coercive monopoly. This much I do know on my intellectual studies side. Whenever you have a coercive monopoly, you have lower and lower and lower service being provided at a higher and higher price over time. This is just a given. So what we have is individuals who are finding ways to communicate empathetically, who are finding ways to not touch upon each other's splinters, who make a solid bridge, who are sending their cargo of logic back and forth and making innovation back and forth. And they see the problem, a coercive monopoly. They come up with an innovation, and then it spreads. And this is exactly how I could see many tyrannical aspects falling. It's through this type of collaborative communication.
I also want to comment on this word you used, monopoly, which is made out of two words, mono, meaning one, and poly, meaning many. Now, there's also this phrase on our money called e pluribus unum, out of many, poly, one, mono. It's monopoly money. If you understand what's going on, it's based on scarcity and fear, and the truth is that there is abundance when you use your mind. Darrell, do you have any tangible observations of how we could build the bridge of communication using these empathetic terms and avoiding these other obligatory terms?
I'm quite happy that you asked me that question, Rich. So I've identified some ways of using observations, feelings, needs, and requests to create a solid bridge of empathy. So if I was going to speak to someone, and I was going to speak to them trying to create that bridge, I would first probably choose to speak directly to what someone's motivating factors are. That's in the needs list. I would speak to it because it would be relevant, but it's an abstraction. It doesn't include any actual tangible strategies. That's usually a good guess to go to first. But the second choice is I might choose to reveal my own emotions. That's vulnerable, but I'm going to be careful. I'm not going to go and use this strategy if I think it could be conflated or confused as some attempt to solicit pity or some other type of thing like that. I'm going to be careful with who I expose my emotions to, but for some people that might create a connection. I might speak of my own motivating factors. That's an abstraction. That might also be useful as long as it doesn't come off as essentially being confused as an attempt to persuade or some other type of demand, basically. And then I could speak to the other person's emotions if I think that they're actually open to hearing about their emotions. But I have to be careful because this could be taken as some type of diagnosis or some psychological intrusion into unwanted territory. Psychologizing is the way some people would put that when you're asking that question. I certainly saw instances of many, many therapists use this tactic. What are you feeling right now? Yeah, that might not make a good bridge, but for some people it might make a good bridge. Those are on the intangible side. These are all in those concepts realm. In the tangible side, for the intellectual person, I could speak to what the other person observes. In other words, from their perspective, I will spell out the scenario of what just happened and try to speak directly to that. I could also speak to how I observed the situation, as long as the other person doesn't confuse that as some, perhaps, an attempt to persuade or an attempt to imply that they're inaccurate for how they see the situation. There's a lot of scarcity either-or people out there who are definitely coming from that model. So I have to be cautious about using this. But I could also speak to, essentially, I could respond to the requests, the actions. I could directly respond to what the actions or the words of the other person. And I could choose to respond to my own choice of actions and put focus upon that. You can see how any of the use of these could be conflated with potential misunderstandings. It's all very crucial. on understanding how are your words being interpreted by the other person. But essentially, those are basically about 8 different methods of potentially creating a connection. And we have the tangible side, looking at observations and actions, words, things of that nature that are measurable. You could look back on them. You could record them. And we have the intangible, such as feelings and what motivates them. All of these can serve as a focus point. That would be very important right there.
Well, I think it's also an interactive process as you observe somebody, as you're communicating with them. You're sizing up, is this somebody who is responsible for their own thoughts, or are they going to take something I say and say, well, you've hurt my feelings? You know, you have to gauge these things because, like you said, you have to interact with different people in different ways because, you know, even though we all have needs in common, people have different needs, different prioritizations of those needs at any given time because they may have, you know, other of those needs already satisfied, right? So it's a communication process, but it's also listening as much as you're speaking, and it's input, processing, and output back and forth to try to refine that communication so that goals can be met on both sides, right?
Precisely. This is why it's very important to understand. And this is why the internal work is so integral to this. If you don't have the internal part already understood, if that is not fully known, it's very difficult to know someone else. But let's assume that everyone has already gone this way. They've done the work, and they see the complete value in doing the internal work all the time. Well, then, in that case, it doesn't take that much to figure out what is the motivating factor for someone else based upon what it is that they emotionally show. Very few people that one would encounter would actually be such a superlative actor that they can completely hide all of their actual motivating factors, that they could actually show false emotions so fluently. Usually they're going to tip their hand. There's that aspect of it too, but here's another aspect of communication. The motivation for why are we having some type of communication in the first place? That's pretty important. Another aspect, boundaries. Sometimes boundaries are merely implied, such as if this conversation got out of hand, we know what is going to be the resultant cause and effect. Someone's going to disconnect. Someone's going to turn Skype off, and it's over if it got out of hand. And I'm doubting that ever would happen, but that would be a fine example of it. Other boundaries can be made explicit, especially when you have some type of long-term communication going on. There's the need for explicit boundaries. And I went definitely through the Nonviolent Communication book looking for examples of refining ways of communicating and making explicit these boundaries. And I think that probably lives more solidly in the intellectual realm of the Trivium method of critical thinking.
You know, there are 2 concepts you mentioned earlier, the tangible and the intangible. And in logic, or the trivium, at least the way we had been taught the trivium, there's the idea of the universal, which is a concept, and the particular, which is actually gone through the experience. And, you know, you see this sort of relationship, and I see now how you've kind of applied the Trivium method to this idea of actually utilizing language in a very specific way to create a bridge, as the metaphor you used earlier, so that we can find ways to have those 18-wheelers of logic go across and we can get on the same page with people, even though it takes a sort of innovation, reading people's body language, their emotions, their splinters, this sort of thing. But universals and particulars are 2 of the most important ideas in the general grammar stages and logical thinking in general. And it's just interesting. It always comes back to this idea of this convection current of causality, the subjective and the objective. How do we relate to these feelings versus how do we externalize them? And it's always it always seems to come back to this sort of, I don't want to use the word dualism, but recognizing the also and perspective with experiencing reality, and then how do we feel about that experience?
And then continuing the process that, you know, iteratively, you know, and continuously as you live, because life is a coincidentia oppositorum, a union of opposites. This subjective, objective, this particular, and the universal. I have a diagram up on screen right now, so it won't be ambiguous. But the point is, It's a continual observation of reality. That's your input. The processing is how you think, and thinking is a process of non-contradictory identification of that which exists, so that you're actually thinking about something. You're discovering the 5 W's plus how in this process. And then the output is the rhetoric, it's the action, it's the communication, it's however you transition what you were thinking about into reality, which is one of the most creative forces on this planet. It's that process that we're talking about, aside from the generative force of the human beingness in the body. We have this ability in our minds, and it helps when we attach words to these implicit processes that all of us have gone through, maybe albeit inconsistently in our lives. But once you specify it, once you put a name on it, once you understand it and see a diagram, you can start to do this interactively and greatly improve your certainty in your decision making and judgments in life, which leads to satisfaction, because whether or not we're satisfied has to do with whether or not we understand our environment. This is also the source of self-confidence. If you understand your environment at any given time, you're going to have a high rate of self-confidence, because you know how to get things done and you're familiar with your environment, where to get the resources, how to put them together, and how to actually make fire or get food or any of these needs that we need to have satisfied, these primary motivations.
Abstractions also, they are the key to consciousness. But to have an abstraction, we have to first sense our world. And then I just love the way in which we can apply language in a certain way, a particular formulation that will help actually manifest more of how we feel about our environment and our interactions, and especially going through life interacting with other people, and in a positive and an abundant sort of perspective, because oftentimes going through life, especially in the institutions and systems that we have to engage in, it presents a very different either or sort of picture, and it's interesting to have an innovative way to get on the same page. But abstraction really is the key, and Darrell was talking about the internal observations, is understanding ourselves, taking the ability to respond to those internal observations, creating a request and a strategy. It's a very powerful method to utilize alongside the trivium, because the trivium seems to be overlaid on top almost. It's just the way we apply these words that have a different sort of relationship to other individuals.
Gentlemen, what is the most important observation that you can share with the future?
I think the most important part is to understand yourself. It comes down to the words of the Oracle of Delphi, to not get swept up in some Ponzi scheme, whether it's ancient Greek or modern internet. This is the aspect of actually understanding how you are seeing things. To go back to that aspect of when you were a child and you purely were taking in your 5 senses without any type of evaluation going on. To recognize the actual emotions going on. And now here's the adult part, where you can actually take responsibility, or the ability to respond, finding an actual opportunity rather than an obligation, and you can move on to know what it is that motivates those emotions. You have the power with that, and with there, you can make strategies that can go beyond the scarcity model, if you so choose. There's going to be a lot of people who are going to choose the scarcity model, and here's what I'm going to especially emphasize right here. Please let us find a way to connect to people, whether they're coming from the scarcity either-or model, whether it's that aspect, or whether someone is actually open to an abundance perspective of and also, and they're looking for win-win engineering of scenarios. That would be very important to me, Rich.
There's the idea of observation in so many different sort of self-help or mystical traditions, those that want to look internally as ways to manifest a better situation, a better behavior, a better way to be, knowing thyself, as you mentioned, Darrell. And many of these ideas really relate to the observation stage, first and foremost, observing the way we feel and acknowledging it, naming it, and understanding, because that's where the understanding starts. Or the genesis of understanding is first naming it, just observing it. And I just think that's such a powerful quality we many times overlook in our relationship, not only with ourselves, but then with other people. The inability to really observe other people's emotions, feelings, what we might be touching as far as a metaphorical splinter, and then our own as well. So it's just that power of observation. We continuously come back to this perceptual stage and this idea of just observing. but it's something many times overlooked because it's so subtle and taken for granted. It's an important and powerful concept to consider.
Well, and I want to close by observing and sharing this observation. Darrell has brought up this idea of the splinter in the mind. He brought up the Greek phrase temet noske, which means know thyself. These are themes in The Matrix, the famous film series that was heavily influenced by various philosophies through time. But it's all there to provoke your thought, to help you think. So if you're motivated to help remove this splinter caused by asking the question, what is the matrix? Abandon your Oracle of Delphi mystical methods and go with what the Greeks eventually did, developing some consistent methods of reason. This absence of reason is what creates tyranny in the world. It's the presence of consciousness and reason that can help us get our way out of it, even through talking. And to learn more about that, that's what we do at Tragedy and Hope. It's all about helping you know yourself. That's what we're trying to do. It's one of the goals of life. It goes on. We will continue to do this every day. And as you get to know yourself better, avail yourself of the other tools that we provide, because this small presentation is just really the tip of the iceberg. It's just letting you know that these tools exist and they're out there, and begging you to, whether or not you want to do it of your own volition or feel that you're compelled because we made a video and telling you about this. Either way, do it voluntarily. Get out there and look this stuff up. Look, I'm using all this obligatory language. I'm totally going to have to change how I end an episode now, thanks to the Darrell.
Thank you so much, Rich. I'm here to help change your words. That's why I'm here. What it comes down to is we've gone over these concepts. We've gone over some of the tactics. I would probably ask for people to look at this version of the Maslow hierarchy of needs, which I sent over to you guys. Is this actually easy to use? That's the usability function. Does it work as expected, which takes some time? So you're using this over and over again. We're seeing, how does this actually work? How does it work to change your language and remove the language of obligation from your own words? How does that work? I can tell you it from a few months' work at this point. Does it work repeatedly? Does it increase and develop various skills? That's the proficiency level. And finally, can it be used in unexpected ways? The creative aspect at the very tippy top of the pyramid. These are important ideas to use. We're using words, we're finding ways to communicate and connect with each other. We now can transcend barriers with these methods. We don't have to have the disconnect now between each other. So many of us have such similar ideas and concepts. So I'm just looking for a deeper level of respect and connection so that we can innovate our way out of various problems that are going on.
Well, I certainly respect this connection, and I have intrinsic motivation to share the abundance. And should an individual prefer to voluntarily visit Tragedy and Hope, we certainly would be appreciative of having more voices and more thoughts, because I know I don't know everything. Darrell knows he doesn't know everything. Tony knows he doesn't know everything, which is why Tony was motivated to organize and produce this episode with Darrell. I was just lucky enough to show up here with Darrell's outline and to be able to go through and try to understand some of these concepts, and you get to watch me try to integrate them live. I think that's entertaining for everyone. So I would like to thank both of you for participating in this landmark discussion, bridging the gap between critical thinking methods like the Trivium and strategic methods of communication like nonviolent communication or compassionate communication. It doesn't matter what name you put on it. It matters what names and words you use in your mind to talk to yourself and communicate with others. So that's what really matters. And thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. Yep. Well, thank you, Darrell. And thank you, Cody, because he was the one who put us together and kind of got this idea started in my mind that nonviolent communication seems like a pretty interesting concept. I'd like to explore it further.
And with all that being said, if you'd like to learn more about how to communicate with compassion, empathy, and substance in your daily activities, whether it be at home, work, or at play, subscribe to the Peace Revolution podcast and visit tragedyandhope.com. You can also join the Tragedy and Hope community, where we discuss such skills and practice them ourselves. And we also feature the history group with pre-screenings and behind-the-scenes footage. You can also fly with us on Twitter to keep up to date with news you won't see on TV. We all talk to communicate our needs, rather to satisfy our primary motivations. It's this common ground where true communication originates, and it's the quality of our actions that is based on the quality of our thoughts. and the selection of words to express ourselves. Tragedy and hope, free knowledge, priceless wisdom. Until next time, thank you for tuning in and not dropping out.